So go ahead.
So let's commence. Just one housekeeping issue. In the future, as we begin the second part of the class, I will identify the materials that are important to read for the next class. So we'll get into a routine of doing that. I won't do that today because you've got the exam to worry about, and I'm not expecting you to do anything other than read the curriculum up to where we are today for the exam, and don't put your minds anywhere else. So now I'd like to launch into a discussion.
Oh, and actually, sorry, let me make a couple announcements about the exam, if that's all right.
Go ahead, Ian.
Great. Okay, good. So see the info. And so for auditors, guests, you don't need to pay attention to this. This is just for the enrolled students. So the exam logistics have been posted in an announcement in B courses, so have a look at that. In addition to the info posted, so the short answers will be 40% of the grade. That is the 8 short answers. The 2 short essays, 3 to 4 paragraphs each, will be 60% of the grade. Obviously up to you how you wish to prioritize of which content to review for the exam. It could be a good idea to prioritize the lecture slides and the lecture videos themselves, along with the Palgrave Encyclopedia articles, to be sure that you're clear on the key concepts. Also, for the concepts, ensure that you have examples in mind. For each concept, have a leader, a company that you can use to demonstrate mastery of the concept. So the exam will be made available starting at 6 p.m. tomorrow, Wednesday, and be available until noon next Tuesday. Those times are Pacific. Again, it's available 24/7. Anytime within that window. You don't need to start on the hour or on the half hour. At any point, you can head into honor lock for 120 minutes. No prior appointment needed. What else? Obviously, it's a closed book exam, no notes. Standard academic integrity implies kindly don't share answers, so forth. The exam content is only available within that 120 minutes, not before. And once you complete that 120-minute interval, it's no longer available. Otherwise, the information is all in the announcement in B courses. That should take care of anything. Again, logistical questions. Haas Help Desk is there. HonorLock has real-time support as you're taking the exam, and I'm available for any questions as well. Any questions on the exam at this point before we recommence with course info? Okay, hearing none, I think we should be able to go ahead. Thank you, Professor Teece.
Thank you, Ian. And
yeah,
I took the exam myself, and I scored reasonably well, but not perfectly. And I'm sure some of you will score better than I did because you'll have better examples that are not as well worn as mine. So anyway, it's an enjoyable exam, and I promise you that. All right, so let's begin. And it's quite amazing that when we talk about innovation, I say, let's begin with related ideas. Most of the good ideas start at Berkeley. And you've all heard of Lean Startup. And Steve Blank, who was teaching, he was an adjunct, he wasn't a regular faculty member. And as you know, most of our talent is in the adjunct faculty, not in the regular faculty. But Steve Blank really invented the Lean Startup idea, and Eric Rees, who was one of the students at Blank, capitalized on it. So, you know, if you think about creating value and capturing it, you know, Steve, I think, did a fair amount of the creating value, and Eric did the capturing value. I hope those two have a good relationship with each other, and maybe they shared the spoils, but it's obviously been a blockbuster idea. But it first began at Berkeley, and then Steve started teaching it at Stanford as well. So you have, dynamic capabilities out of Berkeley. You have open innovation out of Berkeley with Chesper, and you have lean startup out of Berkeley with Steve Blank, all in the last 15 years or so. So here is, and as soon as I heard lean startup, I said, well, yeah, of course, this is right. The basic idea is throw out the business plan. Why do you throw out the business plan? Well, in the language of dynamic capabilities, if there's deep uncertainty, there's unknown unknowns, what's the point of a business plan? So throw out the business plan and get down to business. That's sort of what lean startup is about. And you start. If in doubt, do. You start and you learn. You come up with more ideas. You build. You adjust. You measure, and you essentially go through these learning loops. I mean, lean startup is nothing other than a story about how do you learn when there's deep uncertainty. Well, you don't learn by sitting down and trying to think it all through, because you never can. I mean, remember the quote about the Janway quote we just had up a few minutes ago. The innovation economy is riddled with deep uncertainty. So what's the point in sitting down and trying to figure it all out? You can't. So you get into the market, or you start building things, and you constantly adjust. Now, of course, this assumes implicitly that you can adjust. And if you're doing a software product or something that's software intensive, absolutely you can. But there are some manufacturing processes, of course, that don't allow this. So the lean startup methodology, I don't know why he calls it lean startup. I would call it probably the learning startup, or the startup learning methodology, is not applicable to all circumstances. But let's see, how I've presented this in the past. And to summarize, lean startup has been widely touted and taught, absolutely around the world. It's most applicable when product development costs are relatively low and adjustments or revisions even lower still. It fits comfortably for software development, less so for aircraft or automobiles. So if I'm starting to build and design if I'm designing the 777, that if I'm still in the design process, maybe I can pivot midway through, but the further along you are, the harder it is to make architectural changes in the architectural design. But if you're dealing with, modular items, yes, lean startup fits incredibly well. But if you're dealing with a system, not so clear that lean startup is quite so relevant. I point out here in the middle, it is not surprising that methodology is fashionable and helpful in the era of the internet. However, its lack of general applicability helps make our larger point that the costs and benefits of particular approaches need to be assessed. Context matters, and the applicability of general rules is limited. General Electric, I believe, adopted had a huge initiative going to try and teach lean startup through the whole of GE. And I'm not so sure it was all that successful. And nor would I expect it to be successful in all contexts. Maybe in the digital side, it's more applicable than in aircraft engines. So I'll leave that one for you to think about. But yes, lean startup is a version, I would say it's a version of dynamic capabilities for environments where you're not dealing with architectural innovation of one kind or another. Now, you won't find that disclaimer in Eric Ries's book, but I believe it should be there. It's just not. Oh, by the way, how many of you had heard of lean startup before? A show of hands isn't the way to do this. And if I ask anyone they haven't heard of it, they'll probably be reticent to tell me. But at least a couple of you can you tell me a little bit about lean startup? And let me ask it this way. Has anyone used lean startup on the job? Let's put that question to you. Mm.
And go ahead either in chat or feel free to chime in live.
I'm assuming the reticence here. I just sort of assume that everybody knows about lean startup since it's being taught so ubiquitously, including at Berkeley. But I may be wrong about that. Well, anyway, next time you go to an airport bookstore, you can pick up a copy. It's there with all the other silver bullet approaches to business strategy. So let's think more generally about the fact that transformation of the kind that lean startup requires is pivot. Well, you've all heard the word pivot. I don't know whether lean startup introduced pivot to the business lexicon or whether lean startup appropriated the word pivot into it. But pivot is sort of part of the lean startup mantra. And I suspect that word was well used before lean startup came along. But it's certainly a good notion, which is be ready to change. And it's all about adaptation in a way. You know, we talk about agile organizations. Well, lean organizations are agile organizations. Now, you know, the term lean, of course, came from Toyota with lean manufacturing, which was, you know, about efficiency. So I hate to pick away at a concept that's been very successful, but the lean startup is not about efficiency as such. It's about rapid learning, and in that sense, it's lean. I suppose if you have rapid learning, it's lean, and so the name fits. Let's talk about organizational agility. So there's another framework out there. There's at least, 50 books in the airport bookstore on agility. Well, not 50, but you can find at least 5 if you just go alphabetically. If someone looked on Amazon under agility in business, you would get a whole crop of books. So why do we need dynamic capabilities? Isn't it all about agility? Well, I hope you'll say the following by now. But first of all, agility without strategy isn't particularly useful. Let's go back to class 1 where we talked about the prize fighter. The prize fighter that's laying in a prize fighter is obviously very agile on his or her feet. But where you pack the punch matters too. That's the strategy bit. So agility is much touted, but without strategy, it doesn't mean very much. Also, and this comes back to this trade-off between efficiency and innovation. I mean, sometimes there are periods when the architectural technology and industry is relatively stable, in which case agility is less important. There's various points in time where you pivot. So let's go back to lean startup. Lean startup, you're supposed to pivot, but what are you supposed to do between pivots? Well, you're not pivoting between pivots, right? So there have to be periods of relative stability and learning before you make a decision to change again. And this, of course, is consistent with the notion of punctuated equilibrium. Remember in class 1, we talked about Joseph Schumpeter and about the fact that from time to time, there is disruption in an industry. There's not disruption all the time. There may be small amounts of disruption all the time, but there's major systemic disruption, particularly when you move from one architectural technology to another. But in between, there are times of relative stability, which goes back to the question that somebody asked in the first half of the class is, well, does efficiency never matter? No, efficiency does matter when you're in those periods of relative stability. but you've got to be ready to change. And that's what organizational agility is about. It's about being able to pivot. But the agility literature, I mean, there's a guy, take a look at Professor Gary Hamel, Hamel, who's affiliated with the London Business School. His view is that you constantly got to be in a froth, and you've constantly got to be changing. And we all know that change is actually costly. We'd prefer not to change unless you have to. My message is you got to be ready to change when you have to, but not necessarily before you have to, because that's when you get efficiencies, or at least when you can hold things relatively stable, you can work out the kinks and get to be efficient. But if you keep changing all the time, then then it is chaos. So you often see books like Living on the Edge of Chaos or Managing on the Edge of Chaos. Well, yes, but hopefully not managing in chaos. And agility is really an important theme, but without sort of knowing when to pivot, just saying agility is important becomes vacuous. So, have a welcoming view towards the concept of organizational agility, but probe further and say, well, okay, but I want to have a certain amount of stability so that I can focus on efficiency, at least for certain periods of time. And so I need to know when I have to pivot. And the organizational agility literature doesn't tell you that. Nor does the lean startup literature tell you that, but it does tell you got to be ready to pivot. And of course you do. So my view of agility is that it should be built into organizations, and it depends on strategy and positioning. And if you sense that something's coming, then you better change. Nokia did not sense, it sensed the need for a smartphone, but it forgot. It did not forget, but it didn't understand the need to create and build an ecosystem and a platform. So figuring out the phone part without the ecosystem part was a failure. So here I say, one should not, and these are all quotes from the learnings that have been assigned to you. So we're just highlighting snippets here that, not necessarily more important than others, but can provide the basis for a discussion. One should not conflate agility and dynamic capabilities. Clearly, dynamic capabilities is a much broader and more encompassing a framework. It's, as I said, a workable systems theory. But while firms, but if firms have strong dynamic capabilities, they are likely to be agile, and they're likely to know when to pivot because they're monitoring the environment, they're sensing and making sense of the environment, and they know when to pivot. So agility without strategy and without sense making and strategy is nothing. So every time someone says, isn't it great to be agile? I'll say, well, but unless I also understand how to make sense of the environment, and unless it's got a good strategy, it's not particularly helpful. And remember the quote from Napoleon, agility without strategy is not valuable. And you could say it the other way around too. Strategy without agility is unlikely to be valuable.
All right, working with tech support. 1 sec. There we go.
All good, Ian? Hello, Ian.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, good.
Hello, can I be heard?
They hear you.
David Southern, can you hear me? You're nodding, but I can't hear. I can see yes, you're okay. So
All good, Ian. Can you say something?
It seems like we're back.
Okay, thank you.
we're back.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. So if you really understand this dynamic capabilities framework, it's much more granular than Lean Startup, and it tells you how to navigate this agility efficiency trade-off. As we said when we talked about sensing, it relies in part on inductive reasoning, not just deductive reasoning, not just inductive reasoning. It involves building hypotheses about the future. And it does involve the use of agility, but it says agility is more critical whenever you need to do the pivots. And you need to do the pivots whenever your learning gets to the point that you realize that you're on the wrong course. So agility is a much bandied word, but nowhere near as sophisticated, if I may so concept as dynamic capabilities. Now, this actually perhaps answers the question that was put to me earlier in the first half of the class as to how do you do this trade-off between efficiency and innovation? And of course, innovation requires agility. And what I've done here is show that no matter the business model you have, so different business models allow different levels of trade-off. You can have a business model that is very rigid, but is more efficient, or is less rigid and is less efficient. And that would be, in this case, business model 4 is less rigid, less efficient. Business model 1 is more efficient, but more rigid. The way to get efficiencies is to lock things down. You don't want the design floating around. You want the design fixed. You want it locked up completely, and nobody fiddling with it. If anytime anyone fiddles with the design, you got extra costs. But what this diagram says is that if you got strong dynamic capabilities, you can go further up on this trade-off. In other words, you get both greater efficiency and greater agility with strong dynamic capabilities. So that's how this stuff fits together. I don't know if you find this helpful, but almost nobody that's writing in the agility literature will ever recognize that, go read Professor Hamill, and, it's always full bore agility, please, no matter what. What I'm trying to say is full bore agility when you're at a pivot point, but then you can back off. And it comes from a recognition that there are these periods of relative stability where things don't change so much, and then you can focus on efficiency, but you got to be ready to jump back and forth as circumstances in the market requires. I think it's a cute diagram. So, I hope I get someone. No one has copied this one. It's not on the internet. I've not seen this one flashed on the internet yet. So when someone starts copying it and it gets a viral circulation, I'll be happy. Let me now talk about another related concept, which is this concept of VRIN resources. And Jay Barney, who's a graduate of UCLA, graduate of doctoral student of Professor Rommel, a famous strategy guy. And Barney is now a very distinguished professor at the University of Utah with a lot of academic resources at his command. And he came up with this very important observation back in '86 that really the way to riches for a corporation was to control what he called VRIN resources: valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. And of course, this is an important idea. If you own a resource, whether it's a natural resource or whether it's a technological asset that's valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable, then you've got something of value. That you've got something of value until something changes and it's no longer of value. So I always think whenever I come up with this idea of lithium-ion batteries, the resources there, of course, it's a natural resource, is lithium. And a lot of that's in China. And if you happen to be standing on rising ground, yes, you can make, great profits until someone comes up with a new battery that renders that one no longer useful. So valuable resources is a static concept, and dynamic capabilities is not a static concept. So I often say that the concept of VRIN resources, dynamic capabilities, essentially puts the concept of VRIN resources on wheels. In other words, makes it movable, because you have to recognize that what's valuable today may not be valuable tomorrow. What's rare today may not be rare tomorrow. What's inimitable today may be quite imitable tomorrow, and what's non-substitutable today may be substitutable tomorrow. So without a time dimension, this is not a particularly useful idea, but it's a good starting point, and in fact, it was a starting point for the dynamic capabilities concept. If you read the original 1997 paper in the Strategic Management Review on dynamic capabilities, it saluted to this framework as saying this is important, but we're going to go beyond. So in the dynamic capabilities framework, and this is the second bullet here, these VRIN resources are seen to be firm specific. They're important, but they're not constant, and you can't build your dynamic capabilities is about building a durable competitive advantage, not a competitive advantage for the moment. So the resource-based approach to me is good for a moment in time, but won't enable you to carry forward longer run. Let's talk, I spent quite a bit of time telling you why it's not suitable for the longer term, but let me say why it is important. We talked a lot about intangible assets. An intangible asset is often a good example of a VRIN resource. Valuable, yes. Rare, yes. Inimitable, often. Non-substitutable, often so. So the word resources to me always seems to trigger the concept of natural resources, but it's not meant to. And you can think of an intangible asset as a VRIN resource, and then it's a very important idea. And I think one also has to recognize that there are fuzzy boundaries associated with this type of resource, intangible assets. And fuzzy boundaries is a plus and a minus. It's a plus in as much as it makes it hard for other people to imitate. It's a minus in as much as the property rights are often poorly defined. And it's a minus in the fact that there is not a good developed market for intangibles, but that's a plus in terms of inimitability, should I say. So intangible assets, difficult to transfer amongst firms. Whenever you go to market for something, a market is a great leveler. You want to have a market for your final product, but you don't want to have a market for your intermediate products, because that means people can not just reverse engineer you, but they can essentially disintermediate you. So from a strategy point of view, as an economist, I say, yep, I love markets for the inputs that I need. I love markets for the final product that I sell into, but I don't want to see markets for the intermediate products if I'm well positioned, because that means I can protect my competitive advantage. If I'm not well positioned, then yes, I like to see intermediate markets. So that's the concept of RIN resources. What about the huge literature on business models? That's, go to the airport bookstore again, you'll find lots of these. I'm pleased to say the most cited paper on business models is one that I published actually in the British journal called Long Range Planning, which of course is a little bit of a difficult circumstance, because I'm telling you here that in the world of deep uncertainty, planning is not a useful tool anymore. Scenario planning, yes, but long-range planning, no one can do it anymore. That's why this journal is an anachronism. And it's the only journal in the world on long-range planning. Why? Because you can't do long-range planning anymore. But once upon a time, we used to think you could. And before globalization, you could do long-range planning, more or less. Anyway, so what is a business model? I think you understand it at a general level, but here's a very tight definition of a business model, which perhaps give you a flavor of why it's so important to get the business model right. A business model articulates the logic, the data, and other evidence that supports a value proposition for the customer and a viable structure of revenues and costs for the entire enterprise delivering the value. So it's really about what are the rules for making money in the industry? What are the rules for both creating value and capturing enough value that you can continue to build and transform? So business models and strategy are key components of dynamic capabilities, and that's all part of what you have to do when you tackle this big, hairy problem of how you build sustainable competitive advantage. So just to remind you, I said this in class number 1, but I'm not apologizing for repeating it. The fundamental question in strategic management is, how do you build sustainable competitive advantage? By sustainable, I mean a durable competitive advantage. That is the secret sauce of business. That's the secret sauce that'll lead to not just long-term profits, but it'll also lead to the survivability of the organization. So business models and strategy, all components and elements of dynamic capabilities. So what are the things that I don't like, and what are the things that don't fit in the dynamic capabilities framework? Because it's no use as a framework if everything fits under it. Well, the concept of equilibrium does not fit. The notion that things are in balance does not fit, except for what I've indicated earlier, what I call punctuated equilibrium. every now and again, things settle down. For a long time, vacuum tubes were the main way in which you could amplify electrical signals and radio signals. But then along comes the transistor and solid state technology. So there was a long run of vacuum tubes. But then there was a big disturbance. And, maybe we've had some amount of equilibrium in microprocessors, but the rate of change of that technology has been so great, it's hard to identify a period of equilibrium. So equilibrium is a caricature and perfect competition is a caricature. In the early days of an industry, there's usually only a few players. Maybe later on, there are a lot of players depending on scale. But perfect competition where everybody has the same technology, that's a caricature of the real world as well. And also the notion that customers want products. They don't want products. Customers actually, a product is something that's on the way to a solution. You don't buy a car just because it's a car. You buy a car because it's transportation. Now, that's not to say you may not care about cars. I went to a car show this weekend, and of course, all of those people at the car show are not just thinking about transportation. They're thinking about lifestyle. They're thinking about the way they ride. They're not thinking about fuel consumption. They're thinking about, how do I fit this into my life to solve my problems, which can range from transportation to recognition to joy. That's what an automobile is. So just to reiterate that, it's always great if a company's got inimitable resources. That's the resource-based framework. Well, one of those resources, one of those assets can be the business model. So it's rare that you can come up with a business model that other people can't follow. Dell Computer, started the, direct to the customer business model for PCs, but it wasn't long. It was 3 or 4 years before others had it as well. But nevertheless, that business model kept Dell into good shape for quite some time until the whole industry adopted the business model. The same thing with mass market merchandising with Walmart. There's lots of other superstores around as well. And then there's failures. They don't all work. Webvan was a huge .com failure. So business models can create a point of differentiation, particularly if you keep modifying and updating them. I mean, to this day, Walmart's constantly updating its business model. It's got problems like shrink. I don't know, something like 3% of Walmart's revenue shrink somewhere along the supply chain. And figuring out how do you change the business model to try and prevent that. And then sometimes, one of the easiest things to do is to take those business models and apply them into different geography. My friend Stephen Tyndall in New Zealand did exactly that with a company called The Warehouse. He went and interviewed Sam Walton. Sam Walton was happy to tell him everything he was doing. He laid the business model out. I guess he didn't care about a tiny little market like New Zealand. But that was enough for Stephen Tyndall to take that business model and become, one of the richest guys in the country. Being able to replicate a business model is sometimes a good enough startup strategy. But you've always got to keep modifying the business models too. It's like technological innovation. If you don't improve it, somebody else will. So here is Michael Dell's statement about what his business model was. And that's what's in italics there. This is direct from Michael Dell. This belief that by working directly with customers, we could get them technology faster, provide a better level of service, and provide better value was the basis of the business. I think I looked at Dell in the early days, I think it had one patent. So it had no proprietary technology whatsoever. I wouldn't be surprised today if it has a handful of patents, but I would be surprised if Dell has got a lot of technology. So the whole essence of Dell was business model innovation, and it's very hard to patent a business model. The point here is that's not to denigrate the accomplishments of Michael Dell. In fact, it's to point out that even if you don't have patented technology, you can still build a great business. That's what Michael Dell did. As he said, we screwed up lots of things. That sounds like lean startup, doesn't it? But the one thing we got right was the core business model, and it masks any other mistakes. What's he saying? Dynamic capabilities trumps ordinary capabilities. Thank you, Michael Dell. Get the core business model right, and it'll mask many other, or any other mistakes, he said. I was about to read it as any other mistakes. So that is exactly what dynamic capabilities is about. Now, the question is, does Dell have dynamic capabilities today? Well, that's a nice research project for someone to think about. I think Dell went public, gone private. I don't know if it's public again. I've forgotten exactly where it's at. I think it's still private. But it struggled, I think, relative to the early days. And it's simply because it's an imitable business model. So coming back to the VRIN factors, the J. Barney, VRIN, valuable, rare, inimitable. The problem that Michael Dell has is, yeah, you did something great, but every other company, not every other company, but many other companies have been able to figure it out too. And if you had a Haas MBA, you would know that is eventually going to happen sooner rather than later, and you better have something else up your sleeve. And it's taken him a long time to put something else up his sleeve. So, a little bit more on business models here. As I said, the most simple business models for a pioneer in technology, most simple choices between licensing and integrated production. And in between, there's all kinds of hybrids. So I would still say it's an active point. Every time you invent something, you've always got this choice. Do you commercialize it yourself? Do you license it, or do you form a strategic alliance? And what you've learned by now is that, well, that choice may be taken away from you if you don't have strong intellectual property protection. The only time you really have that choice as a practical matter, and this is what the biotech industry relies upon, the only time you have that choice as a practical matter is when you got strong intellectual property protection. Because otherwise, you can't license it. People will laugh at you. They'll just copy it. So what's the bottom line here? Technological innovation does not guarantee business success. Well, you've got that beaten into you in the last class if you didn't already know it, and I'm sure you all knew it. But one way, and this is the notion of complementarity, ideally you want a great technology, ideally you want a strong appropriability regime, and ideally you want to have a great business model behind it. If you got all three going for you, then you got a really good business. So whether you're a CEO or whether you're an investment analyst, think in those terms. Have you got a good business model? Have you got great technology? Have you got great product development? Have you got great value capture strategies? Most analysts won't think of it that way. They'll say, have you got good leadership? Well, yeah, of course you need good leadership too. But it's sometimes easier to change the leadership than it is to change the business model. In fact, I would say it's a lot easier to change the leadership than a business model. So this is a different emphasis. but it highlights things that I think really matter. So here we have various ways in which business models can be developed. You start with the customer first. You identify the markets you want to target, because you can't target everything. You want to confirm that the price points will support and cover your costs. You got to confirm you got a good value capture model. And if you don't, then you better do it all over again. There's some repetition there to say how important it is. So business model development is this process of figuring out how to create value for customers, entice them to pay for it. I say entice them to pay for it because you can't assume that creating value means people are going to pay for it. I mean, think about Google search. You're creating value. You got to think about how people are going to pay for it. Do you give it away or not? If you're not going to give it away, how do you charge for it? Do you use freemium service? What do you use? These are all complex issues. That's why being a great strategist involves a lot of creativity and imagination and experience. Because unless you've thought about these things, unless you've been exposed to them and thought about them, you won't even think these issues until they kick you in the backside in the marketplace. So that's why I do believe an MBA education is valuable. At least you get to see and confront these ideas so that when you see something similar in the real world, you'll say, I need to think that through, and I think there's some literature on that, or I need to read up on that. There's some experience on that I can use. That's the purpose of that's the benefit of an MBA. It'll alert you to the fact that there are issues. Won't give you the answers, but it'll alert you to the fact that there are issues. So this is another way to think about how to build a sustainable business model. You segment the market, you create the value proposition for each segment, may be different for the luxury segment than for the low-end segment. And then you design mechanisms to capture value for each segment. Don't take that lightly. Design value capture mechanisms for each segment. I can guarantee you with every single startup that I deal with, everyone forgets, not everybody, but 8 out of 10 will get carried away with how to create value. And they will, shove it under the nose of the consumer and say, gee whiz, yes, this is valuable. I know I got something great here. And they won't pay enough attention to the value capture bit. And so they're out of business in a couple of years because someone else has got the technology, or you're just not able to price it in a way that's necessary for long-term competitive advantage. I won't spend too much time on that. Let me now segue. So here's what we've talked about. We've talked about lean startup. That's one related paradigm. We've talked about the resource-based approach. That's another related paradigm. We've talked about agility. That's another related paradigm. We talked about business model, which is not a related paradigm. It's a component of dynamic capabilities. And open innovation. Let's now talk about open innovation, which, in fact, all of these related paradigms, I would say, are components of dynamic capabilities. That's why I embrace all of them, especially this one, since Henry Chesler was one of my doctoral students some time ago, although he knows a lot more than I know. Not just about open innovation, but about just about everything else. So Henry has championed this idea that sort of, in some sense, is another one of these great ideas that is timely and will always remain so in an open, well, not in an open economy, but in a global economy. So what is open innovation? Well, I guess the antithesis of open innovation is closed innovation, which is what goes on in your own R&D lab. So here's a definition of open innovation. The use of purposive inflows and outflows of knowledge to accelerate internal innovation and expand the markets for external use of innovation, respectively. So it's about bringing information from the outside in, as well as about taking innovation from the inside out. So in many ways, it's open innovation has been taking place for 600 years or through the entire life of civilization. But now we have a label for it, and that can help us understand the phenomena, and we can study it and recognize its various elements and employ it wisely. So what are the features of open innovation? Well, step one is recognize that not all ideas and new products can be developed internally. Now it may sound obvious to you, but to many great engineers, it's not. I mean, I remember Bill Spencer, who was head of research at Xerox, telling me that when, way back in the 80s, if you opened the door of a Xerox machine and you had one of the design engineers walk you through the various components, they were kind of sheepish if there was something in the machine that they hadn't developed themselves. It's okay to be proud of what you developed, but you don't have to be sheepish about using something that somebody else developed. That's what open innovation is about. You should embrace the outside ideas as openly as you embrace your inside ideas. And you have to recognize that if you're trying to do it all in-house, you may be missing out on opportunities. Although remember what Elon Musk said with SpaceX. We're doing it in-house because everything that's on the outside has been built for the government, for NASA, under government contracts where they don't care what about cost, they just care about the mission. So sometimes, you have to close your mind to the innovation on the outside because it's inappropriate, but generally not. And even then, I bet you, no one's done a study on this that I'm aware of, but I bet you a lot of components in the SpaceX rockets are sourced externally, even if they're modified off-the-shelf products. They're at their core, there's some off-the-shelf components. That just has to be. But Henry Ford with the Model T, he didn't buy much outside at all. In fact, he was proud of the fact that he built the whole thing in-house. He designed and built at the Ford Motor Company. And the River Rouge plant in Detroit, of course, went all the way from iron ore smelting through to the finished car. So anyway, the innovation parallel here is that with open innovation, you're not afraid to outsource or to insource your ideas. But you relentlessly focus on how to augment internal efforts through accessing external ideas and resources and combining them with critical ideas and resources is two-sided, outsourcing and insourcing at the same time. The lineage, as I said, it's almost as old as industrial life itself. Companies have always relied to some degree on external sourcing of ideas and innovation. Countries have, where did the Italians get pasta from? The Chinese. So ideas have been global for a very long time. And 100 years ago in the US, open innovation wasn't imperative because we didn't have the choice of doing it in the in-house R&D lab or getting it externally. There were no in-house R&D labs. I forget who the first one was. It was like back in the 1870s, whether it was US Steel or US Rubber or it wasn't GE, that came later. It wasn't General Motors, that came later. It was DuPont. It was actually the chemical industry was probably the first in the United States to have labs. So we take for granted now that there are R&D labs, but before that there were contract scientists. That people still invented, but it was the individual inventor working on their own or maybe in collaboration with the company. But there was no organized research and development activity. But beginning, and this is the third bullet point, in the 1920s through the 80s, that was a heyday of the great R&D labs. You know, that's when Bell Labs was built. That's when GE Labs was built. That's when, well, IBM Labs was much later. Kodak was one of the very first to have big research labs. And now most large companies have got labs, although as with the case with Intel, they're distributed. There's no one central lab anymore for Intel, or for Microsoft for that matter, or for Google, or for Apple. It's a combination of centralization and decentralization. That said, there are still many companies that are caught up in the not invented here trap. It's a dangerous trap. In almost every firm, the best ideas and people lie elsewhere. That's not to say that companies, and DuPont is probably the classic case, you know, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, DuPont drove a good deal of the innovation in the chemical industry. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, Bell Labs, you know, drove probably 60% of the innovation globally in telecommunications equipment and in telecommunications more generally. But these were very large labs, and they were very important labs. So to me, this is how it all fits in. You've got three axes to this diagram. On the vertical is the level of R&D expenditure. On the horizontal is a degree of market contracting. And on the other axis is a degree of external sourcing. And you have highly integrated firms that are near the axes, and you have less integrated firms that are further out. So, you know, the Ciscos of the world today, I mean, Cisco has really bought companies that do R&D, and they've bought, you know, the way they've done innovation is not through a Cisco research as much as it is figuring out which, you know, the new startup companies have got valuable technology and then finding a way to bring it in and then integrating it all. So there are many ways to do it, but point here is that there's a choice always between doing it in-house and doing it externally. And these are the key dimensions that you can think about in order to frame that problem. You know, external, internal, and degree of market contracting, and the degree of internalization of complementary assets. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But, you know, if open innovation has been around since the beginning of civilization, why the emphasis on open innovation now? And I think the answer is because of greater global dispersion in the sources of knowledge. I mean, until the last 2 decades, China was not, you know, well, if you go back to 1400, you know, China was very innovative. They invented gunpowder and you know, a number of other key inventions, but certainly through the Maoist period, China was not innovative at all. It's suddenly become innovative again as it's adopted a quasi-market type system of organization. So there's significant innovation in Asia. There's always been significant innovation in Europe and in North America. So, you know, Israel is now a major source of innovation. It wasn't 30, 40 years ago. Now it is. Because of global dispersion, the probability that any one company is going to know all the answers is incredibly low. So you need to practice open innovation or you'll be blindsided. Then along with that fact is you don't have time anymore. You know, in the past, even if you didn't have it all in-house, you could catch up. But today there's a need for speed in product development. And if you're not willing to insource, you're going to be too slow. So having that agility requires open innovation. The third bullet there is digital convergence, which is requiring greater connectedness and platform engagement. So Yes, on the one hand, it's enabling modularization, but on the other hand, it's requiring connectedness. And so that's another reason to find partners. It's the opportunity with standards. You can work with partners and you can subdivide the tasks and modularize. So modularization and standardization. So I should replace that with take out digital convergence and put standardization and digital convergence. So the existence of standard setting bodies like IEEE and 3GPP in Europe and so forth means that you can connect and have standard interfaces. Whenever there's standard interfaces, that means it's easy to partner with somebody who's working on the other piece. And then the fourth bullet there is stronger IP rights. That enables you to, on the outsourcing side, it means that you have a better chance of getting value for your technology. So remember, open innovation is not just about bringing it in from the outside, it's also about licensing to others. And you see from the 1980s onwards, a number of independent companies that exist just basically based on a licensing model. And that's their entire revenue stream. You didn't see that way back in the 60s and 70s. And then you've got the decline in in-house R&D spending. Shareholder activists not willing to support R&D, which is bad for America, bad for companies, but good for the short-term stock traders. And that, kind of forces companies to rely on other people's innovation. But if everybody's relying on everybody else, that means you got less innovation too. So there's clearly a problem there that needs to be dealt with at the policy level. So anyway, open innovation is more important than it used to be. So fundamental are these developments that today's open innovation, I would say, is fundamentally different quantitatively and qualitatively from the innovation of the past, from the open innovation of the past. And it requires new management approaches and systems capabilities. So just think about the implications of all of this. If you're bringing together technology from all over the place, someone's left for the job of pulling it all together. That's what we call systems integration. And so if you're going to be good at open innovation, you've also got to be good at integrating it. And remember the quote, Peter Thiel's quote about Elon Musk and Tesla and SpaceX. He says, one of the remarkable things is how good Elon Musk's companies are at integrating all of this stuff, pulling it together and making it work together. So just remember that. Don't chant the virtues of open innovation without chanting the virtues and importance of systems integration. So this is how these two concepts relate. Dynamic capabilities is about sensing, seizing, and transforming. Where does open innovation fit in? Particularly at the front end here with sensing. Open innovation means reaching out for other people's technology. So that's, the inflow is certainly part of the sensing, and the outflow can be part of the seizing. If you've got a licensing model, then you can, one way to seize or to execute or to capture value, if you've got strong IP, is to license. And that's why I say that dynamic capabilities is a handmaiden of open innovation, just as open innovation is a handmaiden of dynamic capabilities. Now that word handmaiden, not used too much in the vocabulary today, but it means something that essentially assists the other thing. And so I think it's an elegant way of explaining the relationship between dynamic capabilities and open innovation, the handmaidens of each other, or one without the other is not particularly valuable. So let me go one step further now and talk about the work of Roy Adner, who's a professor at the Tuck School. He's a strategy professor there, and he has a book called The Wider Lens, which is a most insightful book and talks a lot about the importance of platforms and of understanding relationships between the various components of a system. So he's very much into systems thinking. He correctly points out that the innovator's success likely depends on the combined efforts of multiple partners. And he's got lots of examples. Better Place LLC, which is working on batteries for hybrids. There's other examples of the cell phone handset and battery producers. There's a lot of this codependence that goes on out there. Lockheed essentially lost its position in wide-body jets because of the failure of its partner, Rolls-Royce, to develop in a timely fashion the RB211 engine. And Rolls-Royce is still a major player, but it was like 3 to 4 years late, and there was Lockheed with a wide-body jetliner without an engine. And the same thing with the Boeing Dreamliner. It was silly things like the battery packs supporting the kitchen and the food warming that were burning and exploding. So the innovator's success depends on outsourced products. And so what does Adner say about that? He stresses the importance not only of alignment with customers, but also with investment partners. He talks about the importance of the ecosystem leader, or what I call the ecosystem captain. And he talks about the importance of identifying gaps in the value chain and making sure you own those key complementary assets. So that's a very similar methodology to profiting from innovation. Different words, but same idea that you need these complementary assets in order to effectuate value capture. The difference between his approach and mine is that he thinks whoever has the last asset that you need is the one that's going to get all the value, whereas in the Teece framework, it's who's got the scarcest asset or the co-specialized asset or the what I call the bottleneck asset. The money goes to the bottleneck asset, which may or may not be the last asset that's pulled together. Certainly if you're in real estate and you're trying to aggregate a number of blocks to build a building, maybe the last guy you end up paying more for, but that's real estate. In the world of intellectual property, where property rights are not well defined, it's a question of, what's the bottleneck? Maybe the last one, it could be the first one. So here he is, Adner, the major prize is designed to go not to the party that puts down the first piece of the puzzle, but the one that puts down the final piece. What did you learn from profiting innovation in the last class? The major prize might also go to the party that puts down the first piece. It depends on whether or not the first piece is the bottleneck. So anyway, it's quite amazing that these same ideas crop up under different labels. So what I call profiting from innovation, Roy Adner writes about 20 years later without referencing it and talks about the wider lens and says, mistakenly in my view, that what matters, the money goes to whoever's got the last piece. And we're not disagreeing too much. We're saying it's not who got the last piece, it's a question of who's got the critical bottleneck. It could be the last piece, could be the first piece, it could be the piece in the middle. So culture, we could talk about that too. We could talk about technology development. But let me just end before opening it up for questions with this observation. There's an archipelago of different strategy ideas out there. You're going to be bombarded with these throughout your entire life. You've probably been exposed to a couple of dozen already. Every time you visit the airport bookstore, which I'm sure are not very frequent recently, because even if you go to the airport, the bookstores are closed. But every time you go, there'll be another set of theories and silver bullets. And what you have to do, the hard work you have to do, because the authors of these silver bullet books won't tell you, you've got to sit down and think hard about what they're telling you and where it fits in. I think you'll find that most of them fit in one way or the other somewhere under dynamic capabilities. And I say at the bottom there, we all need to do a better job of making these connections and nesting our frameworks inside other more general approaches. And of course, the most general approach, but not so general that it's unworkable, is dynamic capabilities. So that's what I'm trying to peddle here. I'm going to pause now, and I'm sure you're fed up with me talking at you, and I'm fed up listening to myself. So let's have some robust questions, because I'm now giving you a good smattering of what this is all about. And this is unfinished business. You're going to be working on dynamic capabilities, all of you, one way or the other, whether you admit it or not. If you stay in the workforce and you're in an industry that's rapidly changing, and you've got something to do with management, you're going to be touching on dynamic capabilities issues for the rest of your working lives. And then for your non-working lives, you'll be thinking about all the mistakes you made and all the great successes you had. And one way or another, this is already in your bones, but now there's going to be a map. All I'm giving you is a map so you can understand what's in your bones, and you can then articulate and become a better decision maker with respect to how to build value and how to capture value. So let me stop there, Ian, and let's see if we have some questions in the chat or some hands to listen to engage with.
We received one in the chat, and there is a raised hand. I'll get to the one that someone chatted me privately about, which is thoughts on outsourcing versus using IP in-house and the value of IP protections. That is, can you speak to whether there is a relationship between IP value and whether it's sourced from in-house or externally?
I didn't see that question, but I think I heard you say, is there a relationship between IP value and whether it's sourced internally or externally? Well, remember, the value of IP is always context dependent. So, the value of IP to me is likely to be very different from the value of IP to you. Not always, but often, because IP in and of itself, doesn't do anything. It's just something that helps you do something else. So it's hard to answer the question. The answer is it could be more valuable, or it may or may not be. It depends on the complementary assets and the complementary technologies that you're combining it with. Now, occasionally IP gets valued when when it enters a market transaction. But even then, if it enters a market transaction, let's take a patent. As a patent owner, I can license it to Ian at a different rate that I license it to somebody else. Because if it's my property, I have the right to do that. And if it's more valuable to Ian, I'll charge him a higher royalty than if it's more valuable to somebody else. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, many technologies that are adopted ubiquitously, of course, do get licensed for the same rate. So DRAM technology, dynamic random access memory, for instance, got licensed basically the same rate to everybody. Mobile phone technology gets licensed the same rate to everybody because there are rules of the standard setting body that requires that be true. But it doesn't have to be that way. Pilkington licensed the glass technology the same rate to everybody. But an IP owner should price discriminate, just like United Airlines price discriminates. But at the end of the day, the value of IP depends on the context in which it's used. And it could be that if it's used internally, it has more high value than if it's used externally. Depends on the complements that exist inside the firm and the complements that exist outside.
Yeah, Professor Teece said, thank you for that. And just a little bit more context, it's real life context. Starting a company, there's a piece of hardware that is used to input a reaction, and you can buy it off the shelf components, you can buy an off the shelf device, right? But we have the opportunity to design it ourselves, customizing it to meet our user needs. And then the ultimate patent wouldn't be on that individual piece of hardware because it's made from known components. It would be in patenting the system as that's done. And so I guess that's my question is, when faced with if your goal is a system level patent, when faced with the opportunity to redesign a component of that system, is it better to, again, thinking like open innovation, is it better to just acquire the off-the-shelf technology and focus on the system? Or in your experience, is there value in, re-engineering individual parts of that system if it meets user needs?
I'm not sure I got all that question, so I hope you'll put it to me in email so I can give you a better
Yeah,
answer.
we'll touch base there. Thank you.
Yeah, but look, if first of all, you have the right as a patent owner to license it at the component level or at the product level. The patent law allows you to do that. If you're licensing it, in my view, you license it where the value is revealed, because it's very hard to get someone to pay for value if they don't see the revealed value. So, like with mobile phones, do you license at the chip level or at the device level? The chip level is sort of hard to figure out what the value is, but at the device level, you know what the technology supports, what the features are that it supports, and it's better to license it there. So that's one observation. In terms of what that means, in terms of whether you do it in-house or use open innovation, I don't understand the full situation, but I don't think there's any one answer to that. And you also have to look at what your capabilities are relative to other people and how important trade secrets are. If you do it in-house, you have the benefits of trade secret protection. If you buy it in, well, you still potentially have those benefits, but then you're relying on a contract to give you that protection. But the ultimate way to protect things is to use trade secrets and not to license, and then to run good protocols inside the company. But I can see it's a much bigger question than I've answered. I tried to answer the bits and pieces off of
Well said.
that I could manage.
All right, so next hands raised, so John, then Haida, then Jackie. So John, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Is it okay if I go back to the micro foundations paper to ask you a question?
Yeah, of course. You can go any way you want.
Yeah, I was excited to read that paper because it, highlighted like some specific activities that sort of roll up into dynamic capabilities. I did read the whole paper. It took me a few days, but I did do it. And all the individual micro foundations, I think make sense to me. I think what I'm really curious about is how to use that as an analytical tool to help understand the success or failure of companies. Like if I wanted to say, if my company's successful, how can I use that to understand whether this is the reason why? And so I guess asking, what's the falsifiable criteria? Maybe from your own consulting experience, how do you go about figuring out, is this company's success or failure attributable to having or not having dynamic capabilities?
Well, of course, you're asking the billion-dollar questions or the trillion-dollar questions. And you're right to point out that I've not completely operationalized this framework, and I don't think one ever will. Now, let's take it piece by piece. Sensing and sense-making. Yes, there are ways to operationalize that. There are ways, in fact, before the break, the question was put, what are the metrics for measuring how you do it? Well, the metrics for measuring how you do it basically imply that there are operational rules that you can, calibrate in some fashion. So some of this is about, KPIs. A lot of it is, quite frankly, about priorities and what as someone said, in business, is not just what you say yes to, it's what you say no to. I mean, that was one of Steve Jobs' key things, which is not what we do in research and development, is what we say we're not going to do. And there are no bright line tests for that. So, each element of dynamic capabilities, there are some operational things and check the box things. But look, part of the problem and why this is hard is that I don't think it can be reduced to a laundry list. Yes, I can give you a list of things that matter. That's kind of what I'm doing here. But I'm not going to give you much precision around it. As time goes by, I think, there's more and more that, it's just not as succinct and crisp as you would like. There's no rule book. So it's the difference between a chef and a cook. A cook has a rule book. It's called a recipe. A chef doesn't really use recipes, right? A cook, it uses imagination, and if you ask a cook what his KPIs are, you're going to say it depends on the ultimate experience of the customer or something like that. Part of what I'm fighting here is that because people want rules and criteria, it pushes you to prioritize ordinary capabilities and sort of subtly tugs you away from dynamic capabilities. Because the more you put emphasis on metrics, the harder it is to sustain the importance of dynamic capabilities. And that's why dynamic capabilities are bled out of a lot of companies as they get older. You'll find when they're early stage and middle life, when the entrepreneurs are still around, the entrepreneurs are not using metrics. They're really not. And they're not even using plans. Not to say they don't look at metrics from time to time, but when you make big imaginative gutsy bets, you don't use metrics. I mean, when Dubai was built, do you think the Emir sat down and worked out what the rate of return would be? No. You've got to, that's what animal spirits, remember the term animal spirits. You make decisions based to some extent on gut. Now, of course, that doesn't sound very good in the boardroom, but that's why I'm teaching you dynamic capabilities, because you can have an articulated framework for why this stuff's important. But it's about the creative and imaginative part of running a company, the entrepreneurial part. The entrepreneurial part, is very hard to quantify. That's why entrepreneurs have trouble. You won't find an entrepreneur running a big company unless the entrepreneur owns a good chunk of the stock, because the board will throw them out. So unless it's a family enterprise. So that's why family enterprises can stay entrepreneurial for quite some time. But you put them in a public company context and you have, quote, accountability. Accountability, look, I'm all in favor of accountability, particularly around, expenditures and so forth, but accountability can be taken too far to the point where you don't experiment either. So experimentation is just as important as accountability. Anyway, that said, over time, I'm eking out some operational rules because everyone's asking for them. But the only reason I'm slow in doing it is because actually getting the general framework to be coherent itself first has taken me 20 years or longer. I only feel that it's stable. Remember, as in business or with the design of anything, you can't make it more efficient until the design is frozen. And you can see, if you read my 97 paper, 2007 paper and stuff I'm writing today, it's moving a little bit because the basic design of this architecture for business success, I couldn't figure it all out on day one. I'm still figuring it out. But I'm actually proving that it works. And I built 3 companies on it, and I made a fair amount of money, and the 2 or 3 times of big stocks, But I'm not all the way there, and I apologize for that. And if I live long enough, I'll have it all worked out for you, and I'll have it in cookbook form. Because that's what everyone wants. But thank God for the Haas MBA. The Haas MBA is not demanding it in cookbook form. You folks, honestly, are more willing to think about tough problems than a Harvard MBA or a Stanford MBA. So you're going to go further on these things. Because you're willing to live with this unease associated without, having crisp edges to things, without having, silver bullet solutions to everything. There aren't silver bullet solutions to everything, but there's a framework here. Anyway, that was a very long-winded way of making a really weak, not a weak, but a limited response to your question. Next question, if there's one there.
All right, so we are a minute over 9, but we could keep going with, it looks like there is another
I want
question.
to take one more because I enjoy the question part a lot
Good.
more than the delivery part. So
Good.
I'm not going to let anyone go until I get 2 more questions.
Haida, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, my question is somewhat related to the previous one, which is companies, even if they start out with strong dynamic capabilities, once they grow, it becomes harder and harder to stay dynamic, and they start to create recipes for their employees and to create more structure and processes and love.
Yes,
So,
I got to get more efficient. We got to get more efficient, right?
So my question is, like, how, your observations and your experience, what would be some pitfalls to avoid? Like, what would be sort of the red flags?
Okay, so let me tell you exactly what I'm doing in my own company. We got to practice what I preach, right? So we're 10 years old with the Berkeley Research Group. We're 600 million, and we're not bureaucratic at all, but we have some of them every year we get bigger. We have some of the features of a large company that's got, tighter decision rules. So I've adopted the structure of the executive chairman. So I've appointed, my president is now the principal executive officer, and he's running the company on a day-to-day business. But to make sure that the company is still addressing new initiatives, I've set up the office of the executive chairman. You'll notice Jeff Bezos did the same thing. I'm sure he read my press release and figured that he needed to do it. But I'm joking, of course. But the idea here is that, a founder in the office of executive chairman can keep pushing the new initiatives. Remember the Drucker quote, the biggest enemy of the new is the old. So, founders have a lot of status, even if they don't have a lot of shares anymore. Founders have status, and founders can push on new initiatives because it's okay for a founder to fail. Because, we've already been successful, okay? So we can take a few nicks. It doesn't finish our careers off. In fact, it perpetuates our careers. So if you've got the right founders, it's not true for all founders, but if you've got the right founders, you do exactly what Bezos says. You create an executive office of the chairman, and you give them some amount of budget. I'm trying to now figure out, I don't really want to have a budget as executive office of the chairman that's separate, but I do want the board to understand that from time to time, I'm going to take some flyers for the company. We're going to invest in some risky things. We have not stopped investing in risky things. Because I tell you, if you let the CFO run the company, what happens is you don't invest in risky things anymore. It's so predictable. I mean, I live this stuff every day. I observe it in other companies, and it's part of real life. CFOs, their job is to squeeze. They're sort of the champions of efficiency and cost reduction. And, a good CFO will understand that while that's their role, they've got to listen, and they do listen. My CFO listens very carefully to other voices. And so you want a CFO who will know when to listen to other voices, but also know when to push. Because look, there's always going to be pockets of inefficiency and waste and ridiculousness in companies, including my own. So you've got to, at some point, say, no, enough's enough of that experiment. When you're experimenting, you have to know when to stop an experiment. When do you say that experiment's not working? The benefit of COVID for us at the Berkeley Research Group is there's some experiments that we're probably going to shut down anyway, and guess what? We shut them down sooner. And so we ended the year with our best year ever. probably because we cut off some things that were experiments. Maybe some of those experiments would have gone good, and we won't know until 2023, when we'll be missing some revenues we might otherwise have had. So anyway, these are the kinds of issues. Some structural separation is good, not big walls, but soft distinctions. Have different champions. You need people to run their ordinary capabilities, and they need the freedom to do that well. But you also need to have other people that have got in charge of new initiatives, and they can't be at each other's throats. They've got to be working as a team. So the top management team really has to understand and appreciate that you need both strong ordinary capabilities and strong dynamic capabilities. But in general, if you let things run their course, I guarantee you ordinary capabilities will drive out dynamic capabilities. Gresham's law of money, bad money drives out good money. If there's bad coin in the system, people will start to hoard the good coins. And so Gresham's law, I just invented it right here in the class, pursuant to your questions. Gresham's law of organizations is that ordinary capabilities left to their own, the champions of ordinary capabilities will drive out dynamic capabilities. Because it's all about accountability. Boards of directors will nod for accountability and efficiency, and the shareholders and the investment houses. Who's against inefficiency? Nobody. But who's in favor of innovation? Well, yeah, the idea sounds great, but in reality, that means waste, doesn't it? Innovation starts to look like waste. Or you mean I'm not going to get any revenues out of this? It's just expenditure? So innovation needs a champion. It's a bit like, I'm getting carried away here. It's like socialism versus capitalism. Socialism is a bumper sticker, which is take from those that have and give to those that need it. Efficiency is like that. It's straightforward. Capitalism is a complicated story. You can't get it into a bumper sticker. You can't get dynamic capabilities into a bumper sticker other than dynamic capabilities itself. Other than the words dynamic capabilities. Maybe I have to issue all with license tags that say dynamic DynCap or something like that to prove myself wrong.